Armored cars weren't always sleek or modern. In the 20th century, engineers were still figuring things out, and the results were often strange, clunky, and impractical. Some looked like rolling sheds, others like science fiction props, and a few barely worked at all. These are the strangest armored cars of the past, bizarre relics that remind us how experimental military design once was. Sweden's World War II armored troop carrier looked more like a child's drawing of a tank than a real weapon. It was the Terrängbil M42 KP, and at first glance it didn't look intimidating at all. The vehicle was little more than a standard truck that had been covered with flat-welded armor plates formed into sharp angles, square sides, weld seams everywhere, and tiny slits for vision gave it the appearance of a giant metal shed rolling across the countryside. Soldiers quickly gave it a nickname that stuck: the coffin. The idea was simple. Sweden, neutral during the war but worried about potential invasion, needed something that could patrol borders and deter attacks without having to invest in expensive tanks. The solution was to improvise by turning existing truck chassis into an armored body over a Volvo/Scania lorry. On paper, this provided a cheap and fast way to boost defense capability. In reality, it came with problems from the start. The heavy armor placed enormous strain on the truck's original engine. What was once a relatively nimble transport became modestly slow once burdened with thick steel plating, serviced top speed roughly 45 kilometers per hour. Crews reported that it struggled to maintain speed even on good roads, and when forced onto rough ground or snow, conditions common in Sweden, the vehicle bogged down quickly. Maneuvering it through forests or narrow roads was a challenge, and its large turning radius made it clumsy in confined spaces. Inside, the experience wasn't much better. The vision slits were so small that drivers complained they felt nearly blind, forced to inch forward in dangerous situations. The cramped interior left little room for comfort, and the steel plating trapped heat in summer and cold in winter, making every patrol a miserable experience. Initially unarmed, later versions carried a single 8mm machine gun and subsequently a twin mount, but firing arcs were limited and accuracy suffered badly when the vehicle was moving. Still, the Terrängbil M42 KP served a purpose. It gave Sweden a visible, if awkward, show of force at a time when resources were scarce and the threat of German or Soviet pressure loomed large. It was never intended to go toe-to-toe with enemy tanks. It couldn't have survived such an encounter. But as a patrol to convoy vehicle and a symbol of readiness, it was better than nothing. In the end, Sweden's KP bill was more cautionary than heroic, a reminder of how desperation and necessity often produce designs that look impressive in theory but struggle in practice. Today, it stands as one of the strangest wheeled armored vehicles of the era, boxy, clumsy, and unforgettable in its sheer oddity. The Staghound armored car was, at first, a fairly ordinary Allied vehicle. Designed in the United States by Chevrolet and supplied mainly to British and Commonwealth forces, it was a large, heavy 4x4 armored car introduced in 1942. The standard version carried a 37mm gun in a turret and several machine guns, making it a reliable reconnaissance and support vehicle. Rugged, relatively fast on roads and able to travel long distances, the Staghound was considered a solid design. But in wartime, solid and predictable often wasn't enough. Engineers were constantly searching for ways to squeeze more firepower onto existing vehicles, and the Staghound was no exception. One experimental variant, the T-17E2, replaced the normal turret with a special Fraser-Nash mount carrying twin .50 caliber Browning machine guns, the kind of weapons normally seen on anti-aircraft mounts or bomber turrets. The result looked like a Frankenstein creation. With its twin barrels pointing skyward, the Staghound now seemed like a strange mix between a truck, a tank, and a battleship turret ripped from an aircraft carrier's deck. On parade or in photographs, it looked intimidating, a road-going fortress that could, in theory, protect convoys from enemy aircraft or shred lightly armored vehicles with streams of .50 caliber rounds. In practice, however, the experiment revealed itself to be flawed. The Staghound's chassis was heavy and stable, but the rapid recoil of the twin Brownings shook the vehicle violently and made accurate fire difficult. Firing on the move was nearly impossible, and even stationary. Bursts quickly rattled the entire frame. There were other problems too. The added weight of the twin mount and its ammunition increased the load on an already heavy car. Maneuverability suffered. Maintenance became more complicated, and the vehicle offered little advantage over other dedicated AA platforms. In the end, while around 800 to 1,000 of these T-17E2 Staghound AA variants were built, they saw only limited service, largely because Allied air superiority reduced the need for such vehicles. Still, they remain a fascinating footnote in the history of World War II armored vehicles, proof of how desperate times encouraged bold, sometimes bizarre experiments. The Staghound AA stands today as one of the strangest armored oddities of the war. A dependable car turned into an unstable gun platform, remembered less for its battlefield impact and more for the sheer audacity of its design. On the frozen battlefields of the Eastern Front, Soviet engineers were forced to think creatively. Snow and ice dominated entire campaigns, bogging down tanks, immobilizing trucks, and turning even the simplest supply run into a nightmare. Mobility was life, and in the depth of winter, it often seemed impossible. Faced with this reality, Soviet designers began experimenting with radical modifications to their armored vehicles. And few were stranger than the attempt to turn the BA-64 armored car into a snowmobile. The BA-64 itself was a small two-man armored car introduced in 1942. It was light, compact, and designed for reconnaissance. Armed with a single 7.62mm machine gun and protected by thin sloped armor, it was never meant to fight head-to-head with enemy tanks. Instead, it was intended to dart ahead of Soviet columns, scout enemy positions, and provide minimal protection against small arms fire. But in deep snow, even this nimble vehicle struggled. Its four wheels sank and spun helplessly in the drifts, leaving crews stranded and vulnerable. The solution, at least on paper, was simple. Replace the wheels with skis and tracks. Engineers removed the front wheels and bolted on large skis, while the rear axle was fitted with track assemblies, much like those found on light tractors. The concept was straightforward. The skis would glide over snow drifts, while the tracks would provide traction and propulsion. In theory, this would transform the BA-64 into a miniature tank sled, able to cross snowy fields at speed while keeping its armor and machine gun intact. Reality was far less kind. The conversions quickly proved slow, fuel-hungry, and difficult to control. The narrow body and short wheelbase of the BA-64 made it prone to tipping, and the improvised suspension struggled under the uneven forces of skis in front and tracks in back. Crews reported that the vehicles were hard to steer, often sliding out of control on icy slopes. At higher speeds, they would bounce violently, throwing men around inside the cramped cabin. Trials reported poor overall performance, and the project was dropped. Maintenance was another nightmare. The hybrid track and ski system was fragile, constantly breaking down in the brutal Russian winter. Replacement parts were scarce, and field workshops struggled to keep the odd machines running. What was supposed to be a breakthrough in mobility quickly became a liability, consuming valuable time and resources for little return. In the end, the idea captured the desperate ingenuity of a country fighting for survival in some of the harshest conditions of the war. The BA-64 snowmobile promised a bulletproof ride across the snowfields of Russia, but delivered little more than a bumpy, dangerous, and short-lived experiment. After World War II, Britain faced new kinds of challenges. The empire was shrinking, Unrest was spreading in colonial territories, and the possibility of large-scale riots or civil disorder at home was no longer unthinkable. The military had tanks and armored cars, but these were designed for war, not for policing crowds in city streets. What Britain needed, or at least thought it might need, was a specialized armored vehicle for internal security. One of the most unusual answers to this demand was the Humber Pig. Built on the Humber one-ton truck chassis, it was conceived in the early 1950s as a simple, rugged solution for patrolling troubled areas, moving troops through hostile streets, and keeping order when civil unrest turned violent. At first glance, the Pig hardly looked like a finished design. It was tall, ungainly, and boxy, with armor plates bolted directly onto what was essentially a standard truck. The result was an ugly slab-sided machine that looked more like a makeshift contraption than an official government vehicle. Yet, despite its crude appearance, the Pig could carry a section under armor, crew 2 plus 6, up to 8 total, and shield them from thrown objects, Molotov cocktails, or bursts of small arms fire. It was never intended to fight tanks or withstand artillery. Its purpose was far more modest, to push through crowds, escort convoys, and serve as a rolling fortress in the narrow streets of Britain's colonies, and later in the cities of Northern Ireland. Over its service life, the Pig was modified again and again. Some received wire mesh screens and metal grills to protect against petrol bombs, while others were reinforced with extra plates. As violence escalated during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, the Pig became one of the most common armored vehicles seen on the streets. For soldiers and police alike, it was both a symbol of protection and a source of frustration. Inside, it was cramped, deafening, and stiflingly hot in the summer. Its suspension made every ride rough, and visibility was limited to narrow slits. Troops often joked that it felt more like being trapped inside a steel box on wheels than riding in a proper armored car. And yet, despite its awkward looks and the discomfort it caused, the Humber Pig proved surprisingly durable. It remained in service far longer than anyone expected, well into the late 20th century, and is closely associated with Britain's post-war internal security operations. The Humber Pig wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't elegant, but it worked. And in the world of armored cars, sometimes that's enough to make even the strangest designs unforgettable. The United States entered the 1960s looking for a new kind of armored vehicle. The Cold War had spread conflict across the globe, from dense jungles to open deserts, and U.S. forces needed something light, versatile, and easy to transport. The result was the Cadillac Gage Commando, a wheeled armored car that looked nothing like the hulking tanks of World War II. Instead, it was a compact, amphibious, multi-purpose machine that promised to do almost everything: patrol, reconnaissance, convoy escort, and even police-style peacekeeping. From a distance, it was easy to underestimate. The Commando was short and squat, with sharply angled armor plates and small wheels tucked under its hull. Its unusual shape made it look more like a toy than a weapon of war. Soldiers who first saw it in service joked that it looked like a giant metal turtle crawling along the road. But under that quirky shell was a practical design. The sharply sloped armor gave the vehicle surprising protection for its weight, deflecting bullets and shrapnel that would have pierced a flat surface. The Commando could be armed with a variety of weapons depending on the mission. Basic versions carried a heavy machine gun, but others were fitted with turrets mounting twin machine guns, 40mm automatic grenade launchers like the XM174, or even a 20mm cannon in prototipo. Crews liked its flexibility. The same vehicle could serve as a troop carrier, a command post, or a fire support vehicle. Its amphibious capability was another unusual feature. With minimal preparation, it could float across rivers and lakes, propelled in water by its wheels. This gave it a mobility advantage in regions where bridges were scarce or destroyed. Most importantly, the Commando wasn't just a prototype, it saw real combat. The US employed it primarily with Army military police and US Air Force security police, and it was also used by South Vietnamese forces for reconnaissance patrols and convoy escort duty. Later, it was exported widely across Latin America, the Middle East, and Asia. Armies and police forces alike used it in counterinsurgency campaigns and internal security roles. In some countries, the Commando remained in service for decades, proof that its odd looks hid real durability. Despite its boxy profile and toy-like appearance, the Cadillac Gage Commando proved that practicality can outweigh aesthetics. It wasn't elegant, but it was reliable, adaptable, and tough enough to survive in multiple environments. What began as a strange-looking metal turtle became one of the most widely used armored cars of the Cold War. And a reminder that sometimes even the weirdest designs can work. If you had fun watching, don't forget to like and subscribe, and check out the next video waiting for you.